on this Easter Sunday, it's appropriate that we not just think of the risen Christ himself, but members of his body who have also died and risen with him. Because that's the call for all of us, that it's not just enough to look back 2,000 years ago at the historical Jesus who's risen from the tomb, but he wants us to carry our cross, to die to ourselves. And people sometimes say, well, how do you do that? How do you die to yourself? And is it possible for us to become saints? To really do that. Because if you die to yourself and rise with Christ, you're becoming a saint. So I'm going to tell you today about two people who are on the road to sainthood. And the first one is Pier Gorgio Frasatti. Pier Gorgio, I feel like I know personally. Pier Gorgio was born in 1901 in Turin, Italy. His father, Alfredo Frasatti, was an ambassador from Italy to Germany in the period between the two world wars. He was the youngest senator in the Kingdom of Italy at that time. He was also the proprietor and owner of a great newspaper which still exists called La Stampa, which means the press. When you're in Rome, you'll see on the newsstands La Stampa as one of the newspapers that's added there. So his father had a lot of money, a self-made man. His mother was from a great family of northern Italy, a very wealthy family, and together they had a number of homes. They had a beautiful home in Turin, and then they had a holiday home outside. That's the smallest of their homes. That's 36 rooms. And Pier Gorgio grew up in a life of maids and butlers and chauffeurs and gardeners and cooks and all of that. He was very well pampered. He had an older sister who died in infancy, and then a younger sister. Well, not only was his family wealthy, but they were not religious. His father was an atheist. He had nothing to do with the church, except because he was a politician, he invited priests into the home to discuss the politics of the time. And his mother went to Mass, but her children never saw her receive Holy Communion. They said no prayers in the home, not even a blessing before the meals. There was no such thing as observing laws of fast and abstinence during Lent. There was no holy pictures on the walls, no family rosary, none of this stuff that we think is the atmosphere necessary for creating a saint. Pier Gorgio did not grow up in a Catholic home in that sense. He had a grandmother who prayed in her bedroom a lot, the way a lot of old Italian women would. When they're older, they pray for their dead. But there was no overt practice of the faith going on. And yet Pier Gorgio grew to love God. I remember in one of the stories, his tutor, a nun, was taking the two children on the street to go somewhere, and a priest came by. He was bringing communion to the dying. And in those days, especially in a Catholic country like Italy, the priest could come in all his vestments with altar boys and candles, and they would ring a bell, and all the people would kneel on the street. And so the sister said to the two children, "Our Lord is coming, passing by. Let's kneel down because he is a king." And Pier Gorgio, who was only a little boy at the time, said, "Yes, he is the King of Kings," and knelt down. There's a story that they were at a Corpus Christi procession, a great procession in honor of the Blessed Sacrament, and all the people came, even the non-believers, they all come, and they stand on the balconies or on the side of the street to watch, and they throw flowers. And little Pier Gorgio, who was about 4 years old at the time, had no flowers to throw, and he saw the other children throwing flowers, and so he reached into the pocket of a relative and pulled out a nice gold pen and threw the gold pen out in the street and said, "This is for you, Jesus." So he had a sense of our Lord in the Blessed Sacrament, and as he grew up, he started going to daily Mass on his own. His parents never knew. He would go early in the morning, sometimes in the middle of the night. When they were in the country, he would sneak out. The gardener would wake him because he had a rope tied to a bedside table, and the gardener would pull on the rope, and then Pier Gorgio would wake up, although one time Pier Gorgio was really asleep hard, and the gardener pulled, and finally the table turned over, and the whole family woke up. They'd know what was going on. But usually Pier Gorgio would wake up, he'd climb up a mountain, a very big mountain. It took me one time to go from his house to this church 3 hours on foot, and he would make it in 45 minutes in the dark. Go to Mass, and then come back home, kneel down and pray his rosary by his bed, sometimes fall asleep on the floor. And his father would come in to wake him up for school and would think that Pier Gorgio had fallen asleep at night at bedtime, not realizing the boy had been out during the night to go to Mass and had come back and fallen asleep. They never realized later on he was going to daily Mass and communion, that he was going to Holy Hour, sometimes whole nights spent in adoration. Sometimes he would bring his friends. He would go to the pool hall, and all his friends were there, and he would say, "All right, let's play a game of pool, and if you win, I'll pay you some money. And if I win, you come to the Holy Hour with me at the cathedral." And the people in the town and the priests, they remember Pier Giorgio coming through the street with a group of young people, boys and girls, and they'd all be laughing and hollering and singing and pushing one another the way young people do on the streets. Then when they would get to the church, they would be all quiet and come in. Pier Giorgio would sit them all down, give them little prayer books to read or give them rosaries. He always carried a lot of little leaflets and rosaries with him. And then he would go up and kneel by the communion railing. And his friends would all quickly fall asleep. They'd be bored and they'd just fall asleep. Pier Giorgio, the priest and people remember, would kneel completely transfixed before the Blessed Sacrament, to the point where one time some nearby candles were melting on Pier Giorgio, and a priest went up to move the candles and saw that Pier Giorgio wasn't even bothered by this at all. He was so focused on the Blessed Sacrament. And then he would get up at the end of the hour and wake up all his friends and take them out, and they'd all go chasing each other home. He was also a good-looking boy. He was a great athlete. He was a championship skier, mountain climber, swimmer. He rode horseback, did all sorts of sports. He drove a car, did all these normal things. He went to parties with his friends, but his friends said they never saw him get drunk. In fact, they never saw him drink more than a glass of wine, just one. They never heard him cursing. They never, saw him become a party to a dirty joke. That he was one of them, but he was separate from them. When they would go on a weekend skiing or mountain climbing trip, he would make sure it was near a church. And if it wasn't, then he would pay to have a priest come out on the train to say Mass for them. And we have many photographs of the outdoor Masses they had. And if he couldn't get a priest, then he wouldn't go on the trip. His friends remember going on the train to, go to skiing, and they would be up during the night in their little train car with 6 of them together, passing around snacks and a bottle to drink and having a good time. And Pier Giorgio would always say no to the refreshments. And then the next morning, they would go to the church for Mass, and he would be the only one to go to communion, because in those days you had to fast from midnight on. And he was the only one who would remember to fast. In fact, most of the kids didn't even go to Mass, and later on they said, our parents couldn't get us to go to church, our priests couldn't convince us to go to church, but Pier Giorgio brought us to church. When they would go to the mountains, and they would get to the top, he'd say, well, since we're resting here, let's all pray a rosary. Or he would pull out little prayer books, say, let's all say a few psalms. And so he led them in prayer, and they said he never did it in a nagging way, but it was always just something by the power of his character, by the leadership of his personality, he was able to get them to pray. He also loved the poor. From his earliest years, he had a sense of the needs of the poor. Of course, being from a rich family and a big home in Turin, a lot of poor people would come to the door, and the maids and butlers would turn these people away because they were so frequently coming. And Pier Giorgio, from when he's 4 or 5 years old, would, get angry at the house staff, and he would run after these poor people and bring them back and order the staff to find them something to eat, or say, well, just wait here and I'll tell my father, he'll find you a job. My mother will give you some money. And so he was very into this. When he started going to school on his own, his father would give him money for the tram or the bus. And he would pocket the money and save it up and ride his bike to school instead. And then he would buy loaves of day-old Italian bread with his money and go through the poor sections of the city and give out the bread to children. And as he got older and had more money available, he did more and more. In fact, when his father gave him a car on his 18th birthday, I think it was, he sold it that day and gave half the money to the St. Vincent de Paul Society, of which he was a member, and the other half he distributed to families that he knew. By the time he was 21, Pier Giorgio was supporting over 125 families by himself, paying for rent, food, clothing, tuition for children. He made sure the children received the sacraments. He was the sponsor for these children, bought them clothing to wear for baptism and first communion and confirmation, and would also go and sit in the homes and encourage the families to go to church if the parents weren't attending Mass. But he did it all anonymously because he was a very famous young man. Because his father owned a newspaper, and he could always print something about Pier Giorgio. Pier Giorgio was a great leader in Italy of young people who were opposed to Mussolini and the fascist movement. And he led demonstrations in Rome, in Ravenna, in Turin, in Milan, and other places where you had tens of thousands of young people following Pier Gorgio Frasatti. He was, very aware of the needs of his country, and so was publicly involved. And therefore, when he went to visit the poor, he did not tell them his name was Frasatti, because even today the Frasattis are one of the three most important families in Italy. He would tell them his name was Brother Jerome, because when he joined another group, he joined about 15 different Catholic organizations: Apostleship of Prayer, Sodality of Our Lady, the St. Vincent de Paul Society, the Rosary Confraternity, the Eucharistic Adoration League, and he was also in the lay Dominicans, the Third Order Dominican lay people. And so he took the name Brother Jerome. And so he would tell the people, my name is Brother Jerome, and they never knew who their patron was. But we have several volumes of testimonies from people afterwards who tell about how good Pier Gorgio was to them, and whatever they needed, he would supply. Of course, he didn't have all the money himself,